All right, I believe we are officially live. So thank you for joining us. This is the very last breakout session of this historic Appian world. I'm calling it historic because we're celebrating a quarter of a century of growth, which feels tremendous, and it's a great thing to be a part of. But you've made it this far, so thank you. We're going to talk supply chains. There's so much to unpack. One thing we're going to try to do is just consider everything we've heard over the last couple of days, try to bring that to bear on supply chain. My one opening thought on this is I can't think of a better use case than supply chain based on everything we've heard this week about process orchestration, orchestrating change, especially design, automate, optimize. There's so much opportunity to redesign, rethink processes, drive into an automation of those processes, and then the optimization piece with Process HQ. So lots to talk about, lots to think about, and hopefully you get some insights, actionable insights that you can take back and progress your own supply chain initiatives. So I'm Damien Chabunya. I run the industry marketing function at Appian, and I'm joined by my esteemed Appian colleagues. If there's one thing I've learned in my professional life is that there's no substitute for experience. There's a lot of experience on this panel, and there are multiple geographies represented as well, multiple functions. Gary, I'm going to start with you. You want to give a brief introduction?
Sure. So I'm Gary Cassell, and I'm the global industry lead for manufacturing, automotive, and supply chain as well for Appian. Excellent.
Alexis?
I'm Alexis Carousel. I work with our clients in the energy and manufacturing sector. I've been in this space for about 17 years, 5 of those with Appian, and I'm based in Houston, Texas.
Excellent.
Cool. Thanks, Alexis. Thanks, Damien. I'm Ollie Wright. I'm Regional Vice President for Northern Europe, Industry, Manufacturing, and Automotive. And I'm lucky enough to work with some of our largest customers in Northern Europe on particularly supply chain and supply chain related challenges.
Fantastic. All right, so we're going to divide our time into 3 chapters, if you will. We're going to start with the macro environment because we kind of have to. And then what we really want to get to is some of the frontline challenges. These panelists spent a lot of time with some of our best customers, global, large-scale supply chain initiatives. They have a lot of insights. So we want to spend time there. And then frontline innovation, I think, is a great way to segue and to think about the future, how companies are thinking about data and process as a foundation for the future of the modern supply chain and how to incorporate AI into that. And then we'll have some closing remarks at the end. But Gary, I'm going to start with you because you've spent the better part of your career managing supply chains, global supply chains. You talk to a lot of customers, a lot of Appian customers. You've helped a lot of global brands get up and running on Appian. And you're connected to the analyst community. So what's your take on the macro environment? How would you sum it up for us as far as supply chain leaders are concerned?
Yeah, so when you think about macro environment and then kind of work your way down to trends, and as I talk about trends, there'll be more the trend of supply chain digitization is what I'll really sort of focus in on. But to understand what's driving that, you go back and look at a macro level, what are the challenges organizations are faced with today. And there's really 3 big ones. I'm not going to say there's only 3, but there's 3 really big ones. And one is persistent inflation. That's something that affects us all, but it affects organizations in a way that puts pressure on margins. And that's due to higher material and product costs. And the second trend that supply chains are challenged with, and organizations in general are challenged with, is I like to call it scarcity of labor. So it's actually hiring and retaining labor needed to meet that customer demand. And it's not just the hiring and retaining part, but there's a widening skill gap organizations have to deal with today. And there's also higher wages. So again, another cost impact that puts pressure on the margins of product sales and revenue. And then I think the third piece is we all hear about this quite often, whether you're reading articles or listening to the news, it's the ongoing supply chain challenges. Again, another cost issue that brings into play for organizations, as well as putting pressure on being able to meet customer service levels, those commitments that are made to customers. And I would add to that traditionally also there's like these three big key metrics that most organizations drive initiatives around to improve in order to combat, those challenges. Those traditional metrics, I like to refer to them as the big three: cost, quality, and delivery. But over the recent times, think about the last 1 to 2 years, a lot of studies that the larger consulting organizations are doing are actually highlighting there's three additional drivers in that. And those three additional are resilience, agility, and also sustainability.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, and you have to look at what are the technologies, right? From a trend standpoint, what are the technologies that organizations are looking at to actually do the transformation work, to change their supply chain operating models, to actually address, these big challenges. And, I think an interesting data point, this is really where the context of supply chain digitization comes in. Because, what we have found is that organizations are really pivoting to more investment in digitization of supply chain. So those tools to be able to digitize, get transparency, visibility into their value chain, as well as bolster resilience. And the other piece there's a nice data point that I read in I think it was a Deloitte consulting periodical or a publication they put out. And it was very manufacturing centric, but it provides a nice data point as to the emphasis on the investments in supply chain digitization. And from the study, they found that 76% of manufacturers are adopting and investing more in digital tools.
Yeah.
And then, if you take that one step further to emphasize even more of the drivers that are kind of making this trend to just continue to gain momentum, Gartner put a study out last year that said, hey, that these business drivers that are influencing the investments in supply chain digitization included things from the study. I'll give the top 5. It was, of course, reducing costs. I don't know that I ever have a conversation where cost isn't part of it. Improving customer experience, improving workforce productivity, as well as improving asset utilization and increasing revenue. Those were the top 5. There was a handful of additional drivers, but by far, by a wide gap, those were the top 5 drivers that were really influencing the digital and supply chain investments.
Yeah, no, that's insightful. It's a great summary of macro issues and also some of the underlying technology trends. Ollie, I'm going to go to you next.
Yeah, sure.
I think of the work you've done with Jaguar Land Rover. I think of Scania, what a great brand that is. A lot of great Appian work there. Philips. What's your take? What would you add? Anything else come to mind?
I think it's a really solid summary by Gary. The words that I hear on my customers' lips when we talk about supply chain, especially even now, is geopolitical uncertainty. So they open up every presentation with, here's my context. And what that means for them is just that's now the norm. Right. So 10 years ago, you wouldn't have predicted that the UK would leave the European Union in the way that it did. You wouldn't have 5 years ago predicted the impact on a global scale of the pandemic in the way that it did, or that we'd have 2 active wars. And so that's the new normal that they operate in now, that have ramifications on their supply chain. And so constant instability and unpredictability is their environment.
Yeah, it's the moving target within a moving target. So you've got your supply chain to worry about, but then you've got this context in which you have to do it in, right? And
Correct.
So unpredictable. Alexis, I think of the energy companies you work with, oil and gas. I know you have a perspective. Anything to add from you?
Yeah, so agree with Ollie's comments. Political instability and uncertainty are major factors, along with global conflict. And in the energy industry, we see that demand is growing despite of or sometimes rising from these challenges. So that's demand for oil that's persisted through the pandemic, even during a time when there wasn't a lot of air travel and jet fuel consumption, and also increased demand for petroleum going into products like packaging materials, as we saw those needs grow during the pandemic and continue on today. So demand is growing. Companies are still feeling the constraints of supply chain and of the pandemic. So those coupled together are major challenges we see, and companies don't want to be overly reliant on any one manufacturer. I think that's the lesson that the pandemic has taught large organizations, is spread that risk out and really learn how to plan for those disruptions in your supplier network.
Yeah, makes sense. I think the constraints is kind of a good lead-in to frontline challenges. Now we've kind of started macro. We're going to drill in a little bit. And one of the things we heard from not just Matt, but Matt's so good at articulating this, our CEO, the data and the process foundation, and how AI is not a standalone function. It relies so heavily on data, on process, and you've got to lay that right foundation. That's where the value is. And so much of, I believe, what our customer community is grappling with is the data and the process. So maybe through that lens, Ollie, I'll start with you this time. What are some examples that you're hearing from your customers of challenges, real frontline challenges, visceral challenges that supply chain leaders are facing and dealing with, grappling with?
A really good summary I had from a supply chain director, so global UK-based automotive manufacturer, luxury automotive manufacturer, and his name's Frank. He reports directly into the CEO of this organization, brought in to stabilize their supply chain in the wake of Brexit and also the semiconductor crisis. When I first met him, what he said to me was, you just have to understand the environment I'm operating in. A good day is when nothing goes wrong. So that's his baseline. He doesn't have a great day ever. He never excels. It's just stuff doesn't break. And so it's like, as a mindset shift, that's quite important to understand. So he goes in, and him and his team and the morale and the focus is all on firefighting and problem solving. So having empathy for that is the first thing that I do with the customers that we work with. And then when it came down to actual solutions and looking at data and process, what we saw in terms of his challenges, this is replicated in other customers as well, is that supply chain is actually a bit of a catch-all term for multiple different departments. So you have planning, you have maybe order fulfillment, logistics, you have finance, all part of the supply chain, but they're often different teams, different systems. They have their own discrete processes, and they sometimes connect, but never end to end.
Right.
And so you're operating that. Good days when nothing goes wrong. You've got this disparate group of individuals and systems and people that help you deliver your products, and then on top of that, you've got C-suite pressure coming down. And so what he really felt was, or was quite interesting from hearing for the first time, was he needed to straddle being able to have a resilient supply chain, but also be efficient and financially responsible. Something I actually discussed with Todd from the Department of Defense on Monday. It was really interesting. It was like, you want to be financially responsible, and so you're going to aim for just-in-time production, but you also want to be resilient and have buffer, so just in case. So you can't have both. So, and that's where I think we really are starting to see customers adopt our technologies and our solutions, that spaces, to help them straddle that line. To be responsible, but have resiliency, have visibility, still deal with sustainability.
I think that captures that operational conflict within organizations, that tension. That's very well said. Alexis, what about you? What insights, what's on your mind as far as what you're hearing from customers along these lines? What are they living? What are you hearing?
Yeah, I think we're seeing that data really is at the root of a lot of these supply chain challenges. And I've heard this sentiment recently: drowning in data, starving for insight. Companies have tons of data. It's often their most valuable asset, but they often don't have the quality or availability of data that they need to make well-informed, actionable, timely business decisions. I'm seeing a couple trends in my sector. One is that companies are very focused on metrics like NPT, non-productive time on jobs, and OTD, on-time delivery of jobs. So leadership is really pushing on these metrics. They want to know every minute that their crews are waiting on materials or services to be delivered from a third party, or on their own teams waiting for internal job handoffs. So they want to know what's causing these delays, how can we mitigate the risks, and how is the data flowing or not flowing in the process that really impacts this NPT and OTD metrics. And then the second is our clients in the energy and manufacturing space are seeing increased demand from their customers in providing real-time job visibility and insight into project status. That's been a challenge for many organizations because that means they need data related to these jobs, real-time, available at any time from anywhere to deliver to their customers, and that's a challenge.
Yeah, no, that's great. And that's the external dimension. You talked about internally what they're feeling, dealing with. That's the external element. And I appreciate what you said about the lines blurring. It's all supply chain. Gary, you talk about risk mitigation quite a bit in the context of supply chain. But what are you hearing from customers as far as whether it's risk related or not? I know you probably hear it all. But what would you add?
I hear a lot, so I won't go through all of it. But when you think about the frontline challenges, and it's like Ollie was saying, supply chain is such a broad topic. There's so many different functional organizations that work in supply chain. And in most cases, when you look at an organization's supply chain operating model, they're very siloed. And they're kind of passing, the problem sort of passes through the silos until it ends up somewhere.
Right.
And you have to deal with it. But it usually takes a lot of effort if it gets too far down let's say, the downstream process. But just to try to go through these briefly. I won't go through the entire list, but those frontline challenges I hear most about when talking to supply chain leaders, and at the risk of sounding a little bit redundant, these supply chain disruptions, managing through supply chain disruptions, by far the number one topic of what I get into discussions and sort of solutioning discussions about with organizations, and it's regardless of whether they come from capacity constraints, natural disasters, or geopolitical events. It's a challenge for supply chain organizations to manage through those disruptions and keep material and products flowing both on the inbound and the outbound side of the operating model. One of the traditional difficulties and challenges that organizations have had for many years, still have today, is sort of balancing that supply with demand. So meeting demand, but not in a way that creates a lot of excess inventory. Right. So minimize that excess stock. So it really gets into that discussion of the importance of forecast accuracy. Highly important, very difficult to achieve.
You're right. Yeah.
And then supply chains are also very complex, and they've only grown in complexity. So managing those supplier relationships, the performance, risk, another highly challenging thing for supply chain organizations to do, especially with the growth of the number of and tiers of suppliers that most organizations work with. And there's also that pressure. This comes up quite often too, that pressure to operate in a more sustainable and ethical way. So think about that as reducing carbon emissions, minimizing waste, and ensuring fair labor practices. But that's, when you think about that, it's just not in the organization. Let's say whether it's a manufacturing organization or not, it's in the entire tier of the supply chains, or those suppliers that you work with.
Yeah.
Regulatory compliance hasn't got simpler. It's a web of complexity with the additional regulations that are being introduced, as well as the changes to existing regulations. It's just a tremendous web of complexity that supply chain organizations have to make sure they're agile enough to actually make change very quickly, get in front of those sort of deadlines or targets to avoid big fines, right?
Yeah.
And then there's always that challenge of, I'll call it cost management, financial responsibility, right? It's balancing cost reduction with the need to drive both efficiency, quality, and resilience in the supply chain. So again, it really takes, when you think about, okay, how do you address some of these challenges, right? It takes a very strategic approach of really leveraging technology, making data-based decision making, collaboration. It takes all of those things and having that access to information to do that. And I would say, as Ollie was talking about, just the amount of effort that goes into sort of the firefighting issues, where you're fighting fires on a daily basis. Those days where nothing goes wrong, they're not that frequent. But so you're fighting fires, and there's, I hear a lot of concerns from supply chain leaders about being able to make the resources available in order to get on the digitization path, to get that needed visibility. How do you actually get there? And I think that's one of the one of the key strengths of like the Appian AI platform, because it's not as labor intensive to do that. You can add quickly, you can accelerate that journey, add capabilities as you go, and start taking some pressure off of that organization with the capabilities you put in place, so you can do more the further you get down the journey.
Yeah, makes sense. So I've heard you talk about this as a journey, the way out is a journey. I've heard you talk about sharpening the saw, which is another great metaphor, and maybe a good transition to this next chapter, which is really about frontline innovation, because we've talked about some of these real challenges, but then how do you start to build a way out of that, and how do you get to a place where you can actually leverage some of the technology that we heard about this week to advance these initiatives. So Ollie, I'll come back to you. In fact, I'm going to advance the slide because I love this shot.
It's a very cool picture.
It's a great shot, and Scania wanted to be here. They couldn't make Appian World. They were at Appian Europe. Hopefully, we'll see them at an upcoming event. But I know you spent a lot of time with them. In terms of frontline innovation and how customers are thinking about the way forward, especially as it relates to data and process, Scania's group logistics platform. What's that all about?
Thanks for that, Damien. It's a really, for me, quite proud and impressive piece of work. So I'm really pleased with how that's kicked off with Scania. So what they're doing is redefining how they do logistics across the whole group, not just Scania, but the wider Triton group, connecting those different teams and redefining those processes. But what's really fascinating about the driver, is actually to Gary's point, is the motivation here is to improve the experience of the employees, the people that are doing the work, that are fighting the fires, that have those rough days all the time, to drive efficiency and drive insight and data into their hands at the right moment so they can make the right decisions at the right time. Nicholas spoke at our last event last year. They're doing some incredible innovation in terms of collecting all of that data, connecting it together, and then now redefining those processes. And they're setting themselves up for that foundation that we talked about to be able to capitalize on these new technologies as they phase them in. And hopefully we'll see them up on stage here next year.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. Gary, I'll go back to you. Frontline innovation. I mentioned the AI question earlier, especially as it relates to data and process. But in terms of the kind of the innovative approaches, models, ways of thinking, what are you hearing? And especially as it relates to AI, how do you get to a place where you can actually bring that to bear on something real and prove it, right? We heard from Matt that we're in this phase where we've got to be able to prove it without a lot of budget. So how do you do that? Who's doing that? And what are some of the keys to success?
Yeah, I mean, you can't really have a discussion about frontline innovation without the topic of artificial intelligence, right? I mean, it's a highly popular topic, and it holds, I'm going to say, immense potential in things like product design, aftermarket services, and our topic today, supply chain management. I would say, most of the discussions I have, the most popular kind of falls in a couple of categories, and it's risk management, I'll call it that, as well as organizational effectiveness or efficiency, so the productivity piece. And if you have that foundation in place, and I'll kind of come back to that where you're capturing both constraints, and this is the most popular one, is in the supply chain constraint area, where you're capturing constraints and you're capturing data from a workflow as to how that constraint is being resolved, then AI can use this data from the, let's say, past events to actually be predictive on probability of a risk that's coming, but also give the planning organization recommendations on how to resolve a risk that they're dealing with today. So the real productivity piece. Now, I think the key is back to the if, right? The foundational piece that says the data's there to do that. If you don't have the foundational piece, if it's that mode of operation where planners are extracting data from systems and they're working in spreadsheets, and when they resolve one problem, it's gone, and they move on to the next. That foundational piece is highly important to put in place. A similar topic that comes up quite often is in the supplier management space. So using sort of the performance data and experience data with your supply base that actually AI can utilize to indicate and predict a high-risk supplier, and even down to the detail level, maybe a particular shipment based on past performance and so forth. And it can actually help the productivity of an organization, both in the supplier management team as well as the planning team, to zero them in on here's where you need to focus and pay attention, versus they're going through reams of, sifting through reams of data, trying to identify, assess, and address risk that may not be at the top of the priority list.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I just think about Matt again articulating the fact that it's the private data that's the most valuable, insightful for AI. That's the toughest to get right. Get to a place where it can actually be used for that.
And those are just a couple of examples.
Sure.
Right? I mean, across the supply chain, if you think about just the opportunity to use that type of power to drive efficiency in the organization, you're going to reduce cost across the organization. And I would even think about it as it's also a tool that allows you to kind of navigate through this difficult labor market also.
Yeah. Alexis, what about you? What are customers doing that's cool and innovative that we should all be doing more of?
Yeah.
What are you hearing?
Well, I'd say first, I'm observing customers really see the need urgently to connect data across the organization. That's going to enable resiliency in the supply chain, improve job performance, improved ability to meet customer demands, and the readiness to incorporate AI into some of these applications. So in 2024, I think all parts of the organization see the importance of supply chain to operations.
Yeah.
For better or for worse, the pandemic brought supply chain into the spotlight, and it stayed there.
That's right.
And really, companies view supply chain as competitive advantage to their operation. When you talk to leaders in this space, they'll typically say the number one role of supply chain is that resiliency of operations.
Yeah.
So that means many different things. One thing that I'm hearing frequently is how do we build local supply chains that provide that security and speed of supply without sacrificing the cost advantages of global purchasing agreements, kind of getting to what Gary said of just companies have many, many different levels of suppliers. How do you balance that and get that right? So big focus for companies there. And then, of course, how do we take advantage of AI? Every executive's asking that today.
Yeah, fantastic. No, I love that. The supply chain as competitive advantage. The book you recommended to us, Breakthrough Supply Chains, that's the nugget.
That's the nugget.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's, so we've talked frontline challenges, frontline innovation. Let's maybe think of, so we've heard a lot about orchestrating change. Appian process automation moves business forward. How do we apply that to supply chain. Gary, maybe I'll start with you. What does good look like? How do you know you're moving in the right direction? If we're going to take some of these ideas, some of these insights, and really make them actionable, what are your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah, so the way I would, from a technology perspective, and thinking about, and maybe forward the slide to show sort of the supply chain operating model. It's just a diagram that sort of helps visualize this.
Yeah, it's a great one.
But having the ability to create or enable a supply and delivery network that actually collaborates, shares information, and has transparency. That's one way, and I think an important way to think about what does good look like. So, if you look at it that way and think about, well, hey, what can I do in a digitization environment to put an end-to-end supply chain together versus a functionally siloed supply chain together. And that's where, having done this work in the past when I was in industry, that's where the Appian AI platform, I get really excited about it because it brings with it all those technologies that you need to digitize the supply chain and make those connections so that, if you think about it from the standpoint of unifying data, optimizing workflows, optimizing processes, automating workflows, having that ability to say, looking across the supply chain, if you're on the upstream in the planning space, making those decisions and knowing how that's going to impact downstream. Yeah. And if you're downstream and let's say a risk hits, for example, I have an order at risk with a customer, and it automatically drives back information and workflows into the planning and the supplier management teams, so you can collaboratively work ahead of that risk and mitigate it and deliver to your customer. To me, that's the power of the platform strategy and the platform approach, and that's how you put together what I like to refer to as a connected supply chain in order to really address these challenges that are faced today.
Yeah, that's helpful. That makes sense. Ollie, what about you in terms of just synthesizing some of the concepts we've talked about and bringing that to bear on a path forward? What would you leave our customers with?
Yeah, so from a practical standpoint, so I echo all of Gary's sentiments, so really accurate, thank you. From a practical standpoint, it's just important to point out that people are tackling these challenges. So we are helping customers tackle these challenges, and they're not doing it all in one go. They're biting off chunks.
It's a journey.
It is a journey, and it's an evolving context which they have to adapt to, but they are doing it. And it's, in some places, we mentioned like Scania and others, really cool. And so I guess it's less of a parting thought and more of an offer that if you want to hear more from other customers, like come and speak to us and we can connect you.
Yeah. Alexis, what about you? Any closing thoughts, remarks?
Yeah, happy to make those connections as well. I think as we take all of this in and think about all of the opportunities for continuous improvement in the supply chain, all of the data that's out there in many organizations, the question becomes, where do we start? How do we start? How can I prioritize all of these large data projects and investments? So I heard some great advice from an energy data leader recently, and that was look at these opportunities and prioritize the data hygiene and the data projects in the context of a use case. So work within your business, find those use cases that have a measurable expected value and ROI to them, and then bring those internally, continue to work together, understand what are the different data sources that are going to be involved, and then work with technology partners, Appian and others, to talk about how to operationalize your data in the context of that use case. That's a great way to prioritize.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, look, we wanted to leave some questions at the end, and we have 6 minutes. So what questions do you have? Anything's fair game. Or we could just end early. That's fine too. Yes.
How do you integrate the supply chain into the acquisition process?
Can you add a little more to that?
So So I'm a government customer. And so, of course, as we're looking into all the supply chain risk management stuff ourselves, we're trying to make sure that we know who's responsible for what.
Right.
In a sense of, hey, from an acquisition perspective, do I really care about supply chain? If so, what do I truly care about? Where is it involved in my process? And then from my actual supply chain risk management person, they're like, hey, you need to start doing these checks. But like what I'm getting at is like, how do you, in this model here, where's the acquisition process within this particular model? Like at what point does the acquisition person really step in to say, hey, this is the point in the process where I need to check and make sure this is happening or this isn't happening?
Yeah, and so if I understand your question, in the acquisition process, and I think this is acquisition of material or parts, pieces, it really starts up in that planning phase. So you could think of from the model, you're upstream in the process in the planning phase, and then that's driving into the procurement space. So, a lot of what in the organization that I worked with, we did a lot of work in the sourcing side to identify, and it was a category management approach, to identify who are the suppliers in this space, and we would run RFQ processes for that. But the challenge was making sure that our actually buyers or our procurement folks had visibility to that so that they were then prepared. And also, when you get down to, let's say, the distribution centers where I'm going to sort of move this product to, then you've got to connect them into that process also, or all of a sudden things are showing up. They don't have a plan for storage and so forth. So all those pieces kind of come together. So when you think about it from the planning piece, it's making sure all those stakeholders are going to be involved in the ultimate delivery of that product to wherever that endpoint is. Also are or communicated with, understand what's coming, and have some input into that also to make sure that what the expectation is from the acquisition is what is actually going to happen as an end result of the process. So tying them all together, I think that's really where it kind of falls in, to me, that just the acquisition piece itself is sort of the first half of this particular model all the way through the inbound supply management space. Because it becomes important to know also with that, when I think about it from a DoD standpoint, I want to know if I've got a supplier that's not performing, I've got a shipment that's not going to be on time, because that could have an effect on my readiness in that space. So that's the way I would view that in the planning and the inbound supply management space. Does that help?
Oh yeah, no, that's what I was.
Okay.
Anyone else? Well, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you at the Live Build Challenge, and a huge thank you to Gary, Alexis, and Ollie.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.